Imagine waking up one morning and hearing that banks are collapsing, companies are shutting down, and millions of people have suddenly lost their jobs. It sounds like a scene from a disaster movie, but this has actually happened many times in history. And every time a big economic crash happens, it doesn't just affect money. It changes the balance of power in the world. Countries rise, countries fall, and a completely new global order begins to form. In this video, we will explore how three major economic crises changed world history. The Wall Street crash of 1929 that eventually led to World War II. The global financial crisis of 2008 that accelerated the rise of China. And the economic risks today that could reshape the future global order. And by the end of this video, you might start seeing economic news in a completely different way. Let's go back almost 100 years. In the 1920s, the United States was experiencing a huge economic boom. People often call this period the Roaring Twenties. Factories were producing cars, radios, and household goods faster than ever before. Companies were making huge profits. Cities were expanding, industries were growing, and new technologies were changing everyday life. And most importantly, millions of people were investing in the stock market. For many Americans, it felt like the country had entered a new era of endless prosperity. Many people believed the economy would only go up forever. Newspapers talked about wealth and opportunity. Friends and neighbors shared stories about how much money they were making in the stock market. Some people even borrowed money just to buy stocks. For a while, it seemed like everyone was getting rich. But beneath this excitement, there was a hidden problem that many people didn't notice. Stock prices were rising much faster than the real economy. Companies were valuable, but their stock prices were rising far beyond their real worth. It was like a balloon slowly filling with too much air. From the outside, everything looked strong and impressive, but inside, pressure was building, and eventually, that balloon burst. But to truly understand what happened, we need to look at how the crash actually began. But how did the 1929 crash happen? To understand the Wall Street crash of 1929, we need to look more closely at what was happening in the United States during the 1920s. At that time, the economy looked incredibly strong. Factories were producing huge numbers of cars, radios, and consumer goods. New industries, such as automobiles and electronics, were expanding rapidly. The middle class was growing. People were buying more products than ever before. And the stock market was rising almost every single year. Because of this, millions of ordinary people began investing in stocks. Not just wealthy investors. Teachers, shop owners, office workers, and factory workers all began entering the stock market. But here is the most important part. Many people were buying stocks with borrowed money. This practice was called buying on margin. Let's understand this with a simple example. Imagine a stock costs $100. Instead of paying the full $100, an investor could pay only $10. The remaining $90 would be borrowed from a broker. If the stock price increased to $120, the investor could sell it, repay the $90 loan, and still make a profit. So with only a small amount of money, investors could make large gains. This sounded like an easy way to become rich. Because of this system, millions of people rushed into the stock market hoping to make fast money. But this created a very dangerous situation. Stock prices were rising not because companies were actually becoming more valuable, but because more and more people kept buying and speculating. It became a cycle. People bought stocks because prices were rising, and prices kept rising because people were buying stocks. This created a massive financial bubble, just like a balloon slowly inflating bigger and bigger. And eventually, that bubble could not hold any more pressure. The bubble bursts. By 1929, some experienced investors began to realize something was wrong. Stock prices had become far higher than the real value of companies. They understood that this growth could not continue forever. So they started selling their stocks. At first, the market only dropped slightly. But then something powerful happened: panic. When people saw prices falling, they became scared. Investors rushed to sell their stocks before prices dropped further. But suddenly there were far more sellers than buyers. Stock prices began falling rapidly. This panic reached a dramatic point on October 24th, 1929, a day that became known as Black Thursday. The market plunged as millions of shares were sold in just a few hours. Investors panicked across Wall Street, but things got even worse. Just a few days later came Black Tuesday. On that day, the stock market crashed even more dramatically. Billions of dollars disappeared in a matter of hours. Many investors lost their entire life savings overnight. Some people who had borrowed money to buy stocks suddenly owed huge debts. The economic optimism of the 1920s had turned into fear and uncertainty almost instantly. Why the crash became a global disaster? Normally, a stock market crash might only affect investors. But in 1929, the situation became much worse. Banks had also invested heavily in the stock market. When stock prices collapsed, banks lost enormous amounts of money. Thousands of banks across the United States failed. People became terrified that they would lose their savings. So they rushed to banks to withdraw their money. This created massive bank runs, where too many people tried to withdraw money at the same time. But banks did not actually keep all customer deposits in cash. They had invested much of it. So many banks simply ran out of money and closed. Businesses could no longer get loans. Factories stopped producing goods. Companies began firing workers. Soon millions of people were unemployed. This economic collapse became known as the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in modern history. At its worst point, unemployment in the United States reached nearly 25%. Families lost homes. Savings disappeared. Millions of people struggled just to afford food. How the crisis spread around the world. But the crisis did not remain limited to America. By the 1920s, the global economy had already become deeply connected through trade and finance. When the American economy collapsed, the shock quickly spread to other countries. Europe was already struggling after the devastating effects of World War I. Many European countries depended on loans and financial support from the United States. When American banks collapsed, those loans suddenly stopped. As a result, economies across Europe began collapsing as well. The situation became especially severe in Germany. Germany was already facing economic pressure from war debts and inflation. When the global depression hit, factories shut down, businesses collapsed, and millions of Germans became unemployed. People lost their life savings. Families struggled to buy food. The economic suffering became extreme. And when large numbers of people feel hopeless and desperate, societies often become politically unstable. During this chaos, a political leader named Adolf Hitler promised to rebuild the economy and restore Germany's strength. He blamed the country's problems on political enemies and foreign powers. Many desperate citizens began supporting him because they believed he could fix the crisis. By 1933, Hitler became Germany's leader. Over the next few years, aggressive nationalism and military expansion grew stronger. And in 1939, the world was plunged into World War II. The biggest lesson is simple. This shows something very important about history. Economic crises do not just affect banks or stock markets. They affect jobs, families, societies, and politics. When millions of people suddenly lose economic security, they start demanding change. Sometimes that change leads to reform, but sometimes it leads to conflict. And in the case of the 1929 crash, a financial collapse helped trigger one of the most destructive wars in human history. Part 2. The 2008 crisis that changed global power. Now fast forward to the modern world. In 2008, the world experienced another massive financial shock. Just like the Wall Street crash of 1929 had shaken the global economy decades earlier, a new crisis suddenly hit the financial system. This time, the problem started in the housing market of the United States. For several years before 2008, housing prices in America were rising very quickly. Banks were giving home loans to millions of people. Owning a house seemed like a safe investment. Many people believed that housing prices would never fall. Because of this belief, banks began giving loans not only to financially stable families, but also to people with very low incomes or unstable jobs. These risky loans were known as subprime mortgages. At first, this system looked profitable. More loans meant more houses were being sold. More houses being sold meant housing prices kept rising. And rising prices encouraged even more people to buy homes. But here's where things became complicated. Banks did not keep these loans with them. Instead, they packaged thousands of mortgages together and sold them as financial products to investors around the world. Sounds confusing? Let's break it down in the simplest way possible. When a bank gives a home loan, mortgage, normally the bank keeps that loan on its books and waits for the borrower to repay it slowly over many years with interest. But before the global financial crisis of 2008, many banks in the United States did something different. They did not keep the loan until it was fully repaid. Instead, they sold the loan to other investors after giving it. Large financial institutions, hedge funds, and international banks bought these investments because they believed housing prices would continue rising. So the bank quickly got its money back and could give even more new loans. Imagine a bank gives you a home loan. Normally, you would pay that bank every month for the next 20 to 30 years. But in this system, the bank might sell your loan to another investor just a few weeks later. After that, your monthly payments actually go to that investor, not the original bank. Now, let's get back to the main topic. For a while, the system seemed to work, but the entire structure depended on one key assumption, that housing prices would always go up. And that assumption turned out to be wrong. But the real question is, when the housing bubble burst. Around 2007, housing prices in the United States began to fall. When housing prices dropped, millions of homeowners suddenly found themselves in trouble. Many people owed more money on their mortgage than the house was actually worth. Some families could no longer afford their monthly payments. As a result, many people stopped paying their loans. This triggered a wave of home foreclosures. And because banks had already sold these loans as financial investments, the losses quickly spread across the global financial system. Suddenly, financial institutions realized that many of the assets they owned were far less valuable than they had believed. Panic spread across financial markets. One of the biggest investment banks in the world, Lehman Brothers, collapsed in September 2008. It was one of the largest bankruptcies in history. Once that happened, fear spread across global markets. Banks stopped lending money to each other. Stock markets crashed around the world. Companies struggled to get financing. Businesses began laying off workers. Within months, millions of people lost their jobs across the United States, Europe, and many other parts of the world. This economic disaster became known as the global financial crisis of 2008. It was the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. To understand this better, let's look at a very simple example. Imagine a farmer collects apples from thousands of trees and packs them into big boxes to sell to stores. The stores believe the apples are good quality. But if many apples inside the boxes are actually rotten, the entire box becomes worthless. That's similar to what happened with those mortgage packages. Some loans inside them were good, but many were risky. And once people stopped paying their mortgages, the entire financial system began to collapse. How the crisis changed global power. But something important happened during this crisis that many people didn't notice immediately. While Western economies were struggling to recover, China responded very differently. The Chinese government acted quickly. Instead of slowing down spending, China launched one of the largest economic stimulus programs in modern history. The government invested hundreds of billions of dollars into the economy. This money was used to build highways, high-speed rail networks, ports and airports, factories, power plants, technology industries. Construction projects spread across the entire country. Millions of workers were employed in infrastructure projects. Factories continued producing goods for export. While many Western economies entered recession, China's economy kept growing. Within a decade, China had transformed dramatically. It became the world's second-largest economy. Chinese companies expanded globally. China increased its influence in international trade, technology, and infrastructure development. Today, China competes directly with the United States in many areas such as artificial intelligence, manufacturing, global trade, and military power. Many analysts believe the 2008 financial crisis accelerated China's rise as a global power. A recent example showing similar economic risks. Even in recent years, we have seen similar economic risks appearing again. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, many economies suddenly slowed down. Businesses closed. Supply chains were disrupted. Millions of workers temporarily lost jobs. Governments around the world responded by spending huge amounts of money to support their economies. The United States, China, and many European countries launched large stimulus programs to prevent another financial collapse. This shows that economic shocks can still reshape global economic power. The difference between countries often depends on how quickly and effectively they respond to crises. But the bigger lesson here is something most people don't notice. Modern economies are deeply connected. A financial problem in one sector, like housing, can spread quickly across banks, markets, and countries. And when large economic powers experience financial shocks, the balance of global influence can begin to shift. In the case of the global financial crisis of 2008, the crisis weakened many Western economies while giving China an opportunity to expand its economic power. This is why economic crises often become turning points in world history. They don't just change markets, they change the global order. Now let's talk about the present. The global economy today faces several serious risks. Countries have accumulated huge debts. Inflation has increased in many parts of the world. Supply chains have become fragile, and geopolitical tensions are rising. All of these factors make the global economy more vulnerable to another major crisis. For example, the economic shock caused by the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted global trade and production. Factories closed across the world. Shipping routes slowed down. Many companies suddenly realized that their supply chains were too dependent on a few countries. At the same time, the Russia-Ukraine war created another major economic shock. Energy prices surged because Russia is one of the world's largest energy exporters. Food prices also increased because Ukraine is a major exporter of wheat and grain. Many countries in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East felt the impact through higher fuel and food prices. At the same time, trade tensions between the United States and China are reshaping global supply chains. Companies that once produced most of their goods in China are now moving factories to countries like India, Vietnam, and Mexico. This global restructuring is already changing economic power. Because of these pressures, many economists warn that if another major financial crisis occurs, the balance of global power could shift once again. Example 1. New economic leaders could rise. Economic crises sometimes create opportunities for new countries to rise. For example, during the global financial crisis of 2008, China was able to grow rapidly while many Western economies slowed down. A similar shift could happen again in the future. For instance, India is currently one of the fastest-growing major economies in the world. Many global companies are moving factories to India because of its large workforce and growing technology sector. If another major global recession happens and India continues expanding manufacturing, technology, and digital services, it could become one of the most influential economic powers in the world. Another example is Vietnam. Many international companies are moving production there as they diversify supply chains away from China. This shift is already boosting Vietnam's exports and economic growth. Over time, this could increase Vietnam's influence in global trade. Example 2. Existing superpowers could weaken. Economic crises can also weaken countries that currently dominate the global economy. For example, the United States currently carries extremely large national debt. If a future financial crisis forces the government to spend even more money to stabilize the economy, debt levels could become even higher. High debt can limit a country's ability to invest in infrastructure, technology, and defense. Similarly, China also faces economic challenges today. China's property sector has experienced major financial stress in recent years, including problems with large developers like Evergrande. The real estate sector has been a huge driver of China's economic growth. If property markets slow down significantly, it could reduce economic growth and create financial pressure inside China's banking system. So even the world's largest economies are not immune to economic risks. Example 3. The world order could shift again. If a major financial crisis happens in the future, the global order could shift in several ways. For example, countries may reduce dependence on global trade and focus more on domestic industries. Supply chains may become more regional rather than global. New economic alliances could emerge between rising powers. For instance, organizations such as BRICS, which includes countries like Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are increasingly discussing alternatives to the Western-dominated financial system. Some members have even discussed creating alternative financial institutions and payment systems. If these efforts expand during a future crisis, the global financial system could become more multipolar rather than dominated by one or two powers. The big question for the future is, from the Wall Street crash of 1929 to the global financial crisis of 2008, economic crises have repeatedly reshaped the global balance of power. They don't just affect banks or stock markets. They influence politics, wars, and the future of nations. And the big question now is, if another major economic crisis happens in the coming decades, which country will rise next? And which global power might fall? Because history suggests one powerful lesson. Economic shocks don't just change economies. They change the course of world history. If this video helped you see world history in a new way, hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe for more deep but simple explanations of global events. And I want to ask you something. Which country do you think will become the next global superpower? Write your answer in the comments.